The morning my HOA president blocked my runway started like any other quiet day on my property, until I heard her voice echoing across the tarmac telling a contractor to drop steel barriers right across the threshold markings. I stood there watching in disbelief as she pointed at my land like it already belonged to her, completely ignoring the painted numbers and the windsocks snapping in the breeze. At that moment, I knew this wasn't just another HOA complaint about noise or aesthetics. This was something far more serious. I own a small private runway on my property, legally registered, surveyed, and maintained to FAA standards. It had been there long before the surrounding development ever broke ground. When the HOA moved in years later, I was assured in writing that my runway access would remain untouched. For a long time, that promise held. Planes came and went quietly, safely, and without incident, until she became HOA president. She started with passive comments at meetings, calling the runway an eyesore and a safety concern for the community. I reminded her that aviation safety isn't governed by HOA bylaws. She smiled, nodded, and said nothing. A week later, she sent a letter demanding I restrict flight operations to weekends only. I ignored it. Another letter followed, then a fine, then a warning that access roads might be temporarily adjusted. That's when I woke up to barricades. The runway entrance was blocked with heavy steel posts and caution tape, placed deliberately at a height that made takeoff impossible. She stood there with her clipboard, smug and confident, telling me the HOA had voted to pause runway usage until further notice. When I asked under what authority, she told me calmly that the HOA controlled all shared access and that I could take it up in court. She clearly thought this was a power move I couldn't challenge. What she didn't understand was that blocking an active runway isn't a neighborhood dispute. It's a federal aviation issue. Every inch of that pavement, every marking, and every obstruction is governed by strict regulations designed to protect pilots, passengers, and people on the ground. Unauthorized barriers don't just inconvenience a property owner. They create a hazard that federal agencies take extremely seriously. The moment those posts went up, this situation left the HOA's jurisdiction entirely, even if she didn't realize it yet. For years, she had relied on intimidation, paperwork, and the assumption that no one would push back hard enough. Most neighbors folded under pressure.
Contractors complied.
Residents paid fines just to keep the peace. Standing there alone on the runway, watching those barriers block something governed by federal law, I realized she was about to test authority far bigger than hers. That realization settled in quietly, heavy, and certain, as the wind whipped across the empty strip ahead. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I calmly walked back to my office, pulled out my documentation, and made one phone call. Within hours, the tone changed. The confidence in her voice vanished when inspectors arrived unannounced, measuring distances, photographing barriers, and asking who authorized the obstruction. She tried to explain it away as a community safety decision. They didn't even look at her when they told her to remove everything immediately. By sunset, the barricades were gone. And that was only the beginning of her problems. If you want to hear how a single FAA report unraveled her authority, exposed years of HOA overreach, and permanently changed the balance of power in our community, make sure you're subscribed and keep watching. After the FAA inspectors left, the neighborhood didn't suddenly calm down. In fact, everything beneath the surface got louder. The HOA president stopped confronting me directly, but her influence spread through whispers, emails, and carefully worded community updates. To understand why she felt so comfortable blocking a runway in the first place, you need to understand how things worked here long before that morning. This wasn't her first power grab. It was just the most reckless one. When I bought the property, the surrounding land was mostly undeveloped. The runway existed first, fully permitted and clearly documented in county and federal records. Years later, a developer built an upscale HOA community nearby, marketing quiet luxury and scenic views. Before the first house sold, lawyers made sure my runway was disclosed in every packet. Buyers signed off acknowledging aircraft operations. No surprises. No ambiguity, at least on paper. At first, the HOA leadership respected that reality. They treated the runway like an immovable fact, something older and bigger than their rules. That changed when she joined the board. She had a way of speaking that sounded cooperative, but always carried an edge. She talked about modernizing standards and bringing consistency to the neighborhood. Most people nodded along, not realizing what consistency meant to her. Control. Small things started happening. Complaints about imaginary noise violations. Requests for unnecessary inspections. Emails asking me to consider alternatives to flying during daylight hours. I responded politely, always attaching documentation. FAA letters. Survey maps. Legal confirmations. Every response was calm, factual, and boring. That frustrated her more than anger ever could. She began reframing the issue publicly. Instead of a legally protected runway, she called it a liability. Instead of pilots, she talked about uninsured risk. At meetings, she implied the HOA could be held responsible if anything happened, even though they had zero jurisdiction. Fear spread faster than facts. Neighbors who once waved started avoiding eye contact. Behind the scenes, she tightened her grip. Contractors were warned not to work on my access road. Security was instructed to log every vehicle. Notices went out reminding residents that shared infrastructure decisions fell under HOA authority. The language was vague on purpose. It created confusion, and confusion created obedience. I could have challenged her earlier. Legally, I had grounds. But I was watching patterns form. Every time someone pushed back publicly, she escalated privately. Fines doubled. Access got restricted. Appeals vanished into committees that never met. She thrived on exhaustion, not confrontation. People gave up because fighting took time they didn't have. What she didn't anticipate was that I wasn't relying on HOA processes at all. I wasn't documenting her behavior for a hearing or a vote. I was documenting it for agencies that don't negotiate with neighborhood boards. Every email, every notice, every obstruction attempt was logged, dated, and stored. Not out of spite, but patience. By the time she ordered the runway blocked, she genuinely believed the HOA's authority extended as far as her confidence. She thought silence meant compliance and politeness meant weakness. In her world, rules bent toward whoever enforced them loudest. Federal aviation law doesn't work that way. So when the barricades went up, it wasn't a sudden conflict to me. It was the final piece of a long, predictable pattern. One that had been building quietly for months, waiting for a single overstep that couldn't be ignored. And she gave it to me herself. The week after the runway incident was when the pressure really began. Not loudly, not publicly, but in a way designed to make daily life uncomfortable enough that I would give in on my own. The HOA president never contacted me directly. Instead, everything came through intermediaries, policies, and routine procedures that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It was escalation disguised as administration. First came the letters. Certified mail, thick envelopes, formal language. They accused me of violating community safety standards, creating liability exposure, and interfering with shared infrastructure. None of it referenced aviation law. None of it acknowledged the FAA visit. It was as if that afternoon never happened. According to her paperwork, the runway issue was still very much an HOA matter, and she intended to prove it through sheer volume. Then access became an issue again, just more subtle this time. The main service road to my hangar was suddenly scheduled for maintenance during peak daylight hours. Security began stopping my fuel deliveries to verify credentials that had never been questioned before. Contractors received calls asking them to resubmit insurance documents already on file. Every task took twice as long. Every interaction came with friction. At the next HOA meeting, she framed it as transparency. She stood at the podium, calm and composed, explaining that recent, outside interference had made it necessary to review all non-residential uses near the community. She never said my name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew who she meant. When a neighbor asked whether federal agencies were involved, she deflected, saying the HOA was handling it internally. That was the moment I realized she wasn't backing down. She was trying to outlast me. Behind closed doors, the tone shifted further. I received a notice suggesting the HOA might pursue an injunction to prevent unauthorized aviation activity, pending review. Another hinted at fines for every day the runway remained operational. The amounts were intentionally vague. The threat wasn't the money. It was the process. Lawyers.
Time.
Stress. Most people would have reacted emotionally by then. Argued. Posted online. Demanded emergency votes. That reaction is exactly what she expected. HOA power feeds on public conflict. The louder the argument, the more justification they claim for control. I did the opposite. I went quiet. While she escalated through neighborhood channels, I escalated through regulatory ones. I requested formal obstruction evaluations. I filed safety hazard reports. I asked for written confirmation of airspace status and access protections. Each response came back clear, unemotional, and devastating to her position. The runway was lawful. The obstruction was documented. The interference was ongoing. She still didn't know how much of this was happening. Instead, she pushed harder. She sent out a community alert implying that pilots were ignoring safety concerns. She encouraged residents to document incidents, no matter how minor. A child startled by noise. A dog barking. A shadow passing over a yard. Everything became evidence in her narrative, even if none of it mattered legally. That's when the realization fully settled in. This wasn't about safety, aesthetics, or community harmony. It was about authority. She couldn't stand that something existed inside her HOA's borders that she didn't control. The runway wasn't the problem. It was the proof that her power had limits. And she was determined to erase that proof, even if it meant stepping deeper into territory she didn't understand. What she saw as persistence was actually documentation piling up against her. Every notice, every delay, every misleading statement strengthened a case she never realized she was building for me. The tension she created wasn't pushing me back. It was pushing the situation toward an outcome she could no longer manage. By the time the fourth week rolled around, the HOA president's frustration was palpable, even if she still maintained a calm exterior in public. What she didn't realize was that all her efforts had been quietly funneled into one predictable outcome: her complete exposure. While she worked to intimidate, delay, and confuse, I had been quietly building a case that left no room for negotiation or ambiguity. I started by cataloging everything. Every email, every certified letter, every notice about safety concerns or shared infrastructure, along with timestamps and official FAA responses, went into a single, organized binder. Photos of the barricades, measurements, and compliance certificates from certified surveyors documented that the runway was entirely within legal bounds. It wasn't just preparation. It was a silent, unassailable argument waiting to be presented to the proper authorities. I wasn't reacting impulsively. I was executing a methodical plan. Next, I ensured that key federal agencies were aware. One simple phone call to the FAA's Regional Compliance Office opened a chain of communications that she couldn't touch. I didn't make threats, I didn't exaggerate, and I certainly didn't confront her personally. I simply provided facts: obstruction of a legally recognized runway, unauthorized barriers, and repeated interference. The documents spoke for themselves. The FAA responded quickly, scheduling an inspection and requesting clarification from the HOA. Meanwhile, the HOA president continued as if her power was intact. She believed she had the upper hand, assuming that the slow bureaucracy of government agencies would give her time to claim compliance or leverage community sentiment. She sent more letters, attempted to pressure neighbors to record incidents, and subtly implied legal consequences for me. Each effort, however, only reinforced the record I had quietly built. Every attempt to assert control became another line of evidence. The turning point came when FAA inspectors arrived on site. They measured, photographed, and documented everything: the runway, the barricades, the access routes, and all obstructions. The HOA president tried to explain her position as a community safety measure, but the inspectors were methodical, thorough, and indifferent to HOA politics. They weren't swayed by charm or intimidation. They followed federal regulations. The result was immediate. Instructions were issued to remove all unauthorized barriers, and any future interference would be treated as a violation of federal law. What was happening behind the scenes was even more satisfying. The record I had built quietly created accountability that she could not evade. Contractors, neighbors, and HOA board members all became witnesses without ever realizing it. By trying to assert her control, she had inadvertently strengthened my position in every way possible. The silent countermove had worked exactly as intended. In those quiet days following the FAA inspection, the atmosphere shifted. The HOA president no longer made direct contact. Her emails became tentative. Her community updates carefully neutral. She had been forced to recalibrate her sense of authority because the reality was clear. Her power did not extend beyond the bounds of the law, and every overreach now carried real, federal consequences. The very infrastructure she tried to dominate was now shielded, documented, and enforced by agencies that don't negotiate with neighborhood boards. And that was the essence of the turning point. I didn't have to confront her with anger or loud confrontation. My preparation, patience, and reliance on proper channels created a silent, irreversible shift. She believed she was controlling the narrative, but in reality, she had stepped into a system far bigger than herself, and it was one she could not manipulate. Her overconfidence had become her undoing, setting the stage for a payoff she never anticipated. From that moment, every move she made was cautious, defensive, and reactionary. She had been outmaneuvered without me ever raising my voice, without threats, and without any need for public spectacle. The silent, calculated strategy had reached its peak, and the next phase, the final payoff, was inevitable. The final fallout didn't arrive with shouting or dramatic confrontations. It arrived quietly, in official envelopes, closed-door meetings, and sudden changes in tone that everyone in the community could feel. Within days of the FAA's formal findings being issued, the HOA's legal counsel stepped in. Not to challenge the decision, but to contain the damage. That alone told me everything I needed to know. The first sign was an emergency HOA board meeting that residents weren't invited to attend. No agenda was published. No minutes were released afterward. What did circulate, however, was a short notice stating that all matters involving aviation-adjacent infrastructure were no longer under HOA consideration. The language was careful, almost surgical. It was the kind of wording used when someone is trying to quietly reverse course without admitting fault. Then the president disappeared. Her name stopped appearing on emails. Community updates came and signed. Requests that once took weeks were suddenly approved without comment. Contractors who had been warned away were told the warnings had been miscommunications. The same access road that had been perpetually under maintenance was cleared in a single afternoon. It was as if an invisible hand had reset everything back to the way it had been before she decided to test authority she didn't understand. Behind the scenes, the consequences were far less subtle. The FAA's report didn't just address the barricades. It documented a pattern of interference and misrepresentation. That report was forwarded to county officials, zoning authorities, and the HOA's insurance carrier. Once insurers get involved, patience evaporates. Policies don't cover deliberate violations of federal safety regulations, and premiums don't forgive reckless leadership. Within 2 weeks, a special notice went out to homeowners announcing a leadership change. The explanation was vague, citing personal reasons and the best interests of the community. No farewell message. No thank you note. Just a quiet removal of the person who had spent months asserting control over something that was never hers to touch. People whispered. Everyone understood. I never celebrated publicly. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't send emails pointing out how wrong she'd been. I didn't need to. The outcome spoke for itself. The runway remained open, unobstructed, and officially protected. My documentation was archived. The agencies involved closed their cases with clear warnings attached to the property records. Any future interference would trigger immediate enforcement without further discussion. The most telling moment came weeks later when a new HOA board member approached me privately. He thanked me for being patient and admitted that many residents had felt powerless under the previous leadership. He said the situation had been a wake-up call. HOAs have limits. Authority has boundaries. And pretending otherwise carries consequences that can't be voted away. The irony was simple and perfect. The president had tried to ground my runway to prove control. Instead, she grounded her own position by forcing federal oversight into a space where it had never needed to intervene before. Her desire to dominate turned into a permanent record that now protects the very thing she wanted gone. Today, planes still come and go as they always have. Quietly, safely, legally. The community is calmer, not because someone finally asserted HOA power, but because that power was finally checked. The balance shifted back to where it belonged. I didn't win by being louder, richer, or more aggressive. I won by understanding the difference between neighborhood rules and federal law, and knowing exactly when to let one override the other. And that's the lesson her empty office made very clear. Some authority isn't challenged with arguments. It's challenged with one well-documented phone call.